Hello and welcome back to The Usual Places, a podcast that focuses on the original Xbox, Xbox 360, and related modding communities, where we talk about news in the scene and chat with developers, both in the homebrew community and those who worked at game studios that contributed to the Xbox platform. I'm your host, Scotch, and in today's episode, we'll be having part 2 of our discussion about the original Xbox's boot animation. If you haven't heard our last episode with Pipeworks Studios, I recommend listening to that one first, as it'll give you some added context to this episode today. We did originally plan on publishing today's conversation as part of episode 5, but to help keep runtimes at a reasonable length, we decided to split today's conversation into its own segment. Before we get into that, though, I do want to remind any listeners about the Modfest that's still going on. In case you missed it, this is a community-driven event where homebrew developers can make and submit software or hardware, and the top submissions will win prizes. This event aims to encourage homebrew development in the modding scene and spur activity, and it's a great way to contribute back to the community through new open source projects being published. The event is still going on for a few more weeks, with the due date being January 31st of 2025. For more info, check out xbox-scene.info. And with that, let's jump right into it. So switching gears, next up we're going to be talking with Brian Schmidt. Brian is an accomplished composer and sound designer with a prolific career in the video game industry, starting all the way back in 1987 at Williams Electronic Games. Contributed to titles such as Black Knight 2000, Space Station, and NARC. In 1998, Brian joined Microsoft as the program manager for Direct Sound and Direct Music. From 1999 to 2008, he led the Xbox Audio and Voice Technologies division, where he worked on developing the audio architecture for both the original Xbox and Xbox 360 consoles. He's also known for crafting the startup sound for the original Xbox's boot animation sequence, employing skills from his earlier days to create this iconic 8-second sound sequence using only 25 kilobytes of memory. Brian, thank you so much for coming on. We're thrilled to talk to you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you as well. Just to kick it off, I kind of wanted to tell our listeners about your background and kind of how you got into this industry, just kind of the early days. So I noticed you have degrees in both music and computer science from Northwestern University, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. Could you tell us a bit about what made you choose this path? Like, this is kind of an interesting combination of music and, tech. What sort of led you down this path early on?
It's complete serendipity, which is kind of crazy. I went to school to be a performance major. I was actually a tuba major, although I can really consider bass guitar my main instrument. And through sheer coincidence, my sophomore year at Northwestern, the School of Music got a fairly hefty grant, about $3 million, to study 3D hearing, and it set up a brand new computer music lab. And having been exposed to that, I kind of fell in love with music technology. And so I kind of switched my path from being a performance major to a composition major, and also saying, hey, I really like the tech side of audio as well. And that's where I decided to get a CS degree as well as my music degree. So it was kind of just a happenstance that I happened to be at this place that got a big grant to do computer music, and kind of helped bring up, there was a group of only about a half dozen to a dozen of us between faculty and staff and grad students that kind of built from scratch this computer music research lab. And at the time, right, this was several years before MIDI was invented. So digital audio was a very, very new field, right? There was no digital audio editors. There's no everything that we kind of take for granted today didn't really exist back then. So I just found it very fascinating. And so ended up with 2 degrees. And then again, kind of coincidentally, when I was, I also got my master's degree, computer applications and music. And when I was finishing up my thesis, it turns out a job opened up at a pinball machine company called Williams Electronic Games, like you mentioned. And they were looking for people who could both compose music and also program at a pretty low level. And I had been playing pinball my whole life. My mom used to get mad at me for wasting my allowance playing pinball. So the idea of working on pinball machines, doing computers and music, I thought was just really fascinating. So I feel bad telling that story these days, because people who want to get into game audio, it's extremely competitive now and lots of really, really skilled people. And then I'd have to really just kind of admit, yeah, I kind of just fell into it.
Kind of in the right place at the right time sort of thing?
Yeah, right place, right time, right interest, right skills happen. And you know, a passionate love of, for me, pinball. I used to really, really love playing pinball. Like, I literally did waste lots of money playing pinball when I was a kid. So, then, you know, later when I'm on the hiring side of the fence, I understand that, yeah, when a game company hires a composer or a sound designer or something like that, or actually, I suppose any employee, you want to hire people who are passionate about the kinds of things that you were building. So I kind of get it now, why they like the fact that I was, you know, very much into pinball and kind of had this unique combination of skills at the time. You know, again, low level programming plus music composition.
Right, right. So in the early days, as you alluded to, you didn't quite have all the creature comforts and the luxuries that we have today, where you can just open something up in a DAW or your editing software and mix and master and cut and edit and all that. So I
Yeah,
imagine on
it
pinball
was
machines,
it was
you're go ahead.
yeah, no, it's, pinball machines, you know, as you're sort of starting to get to there, it was very much like doing, you know, other kinds of arcade games or console games at the time, in that you know, nowadays, if you wanna put music into a game, you just go to a studio, record some music, and you can put it into the game. But back then, that wasn't possible. The technology simply did not exist in a practical way to allow you to go into a studio, record music, and put it into a game. And so all of these game systems, whether it's a pinball machine or or arcade video game or a Sega Genesis or a Super Nintendo, they had sound synthesis chips in them. And so all of the sound you hear in an arcade game or a console game from that era is synthesized in real time on these little synthesizer chips, and they have little microprocessors in the systems that tell the synthesizer, "Okay, play this note now for this long with this patch, and, you know, now play this note." And so the act of doing sound and music for games back then was creating these lists of note commands, which tell the synthesizer when and what to play on a note-by-note basis. So again, you know, play the bass guitar sound with an E for an eighth note duration, and now play that same bass guitar sound with a G with a quarter note duration, and these lists and lists that we would make of these notes that represented the compositions that we had. And that's what today in the kind of vernacular is called chip tune music, right? It's not wave files in a studio, it's lists of commands to tell these synthesizer chips when to play what, and that's how we did stuff back then. Up through the mid to late '90s, that's kinda how game music was.
So I'm guessing that's where the programming knowledge came from, right? Because it wasn't as simple as, "Here's a MIDI file, just play this." They actually had to program that into the actual code itself to play the tune.
Exactly right. We had these custom little computer systems that we wrote from scratch, that were very unique to, you know, the needs of the game, and, yeah, so that's what we did, you know, so it was a combination of writing these lists of notes, that's kind of the music composer hat on,
Mhm.
but also writing and maintaining this custom computer code that knows how to listen for a command from the main game processor, figure out what sound effect to play, create these sequences, and in some cases do, you know, fairly fancy things like, when you get a command from the game to change the music, don't change the music quite yet. Let's wait till a musically appropriate time and change the music,
Yeah.
you know, on the next half note or at the start of the next measure. Or when we play this sound effect, the computer system would look at the underlying background music and say, "Oh, the background music is currently playing an E minor chord. Let me make sure this sound effect works well in E minor." So, yeah, the writing, the maintaining of all that code was part of the job, as well as writing the music and doing the sound effects, and that's why they were looking again for sort of someone who could kind of, straddle both worlds there.
Yeah, it's interesting how the after those systems had sort of matured, you had what is essentially pretty high quality synthesizer audio coming out to the player, and then at some point, you know, during the '90s or so, and especially in video game consoles, when you only had so much space on a disc or, you know, even on a floppy during certain eras, it seems like if you weren't using those synthesized generated sounds, there was almost like a time period where some games at least had a more crunchy, you could say, or compressed version of their sounds that would play. So, and you've been around basically this whole time. Did you see a transition like that happen where you'd have to just compress, you know, wave files down to just crunch it down to the point where it could fit on a disc, and then did it sound worse after that?
That was half of the art of working with digital audio samples in game consoles and arcade games. Right today, in order to have high fidelity audio that we would use like in a movie or in a modern day video game, you need to store about 48,000 data points for every second of sound. And back then, we were trying to do things where maybe we'd store 4,000 data points or even less. Memory was really the driving thing behind all of the work of trying to do game audio because it was just so limited. Literally, in the first pinball machines that I worked on, the entire musical score and the code that ran it, that sort of audio system driver I was talking about before, had to fit in, if I'm recalling correctly, like less than 32 kilobytes of memory. Certainly less than 64, but I'm pretty sure most of the systems it was less than 32 kilobytes. So that's like virtually nothing these days, obviously. But that was because of the cost of the computer memory chips. That's all we could afford to put into a pinball machine for its sound. And likewise, for a game console like the Sega Genesis or a Super Nintendo, if there was a game that was 128 kilobytes or 256 kilobytes, that was considered a reasonably big game. I would say the big game changer was 2000, 2001 with the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox. There was a period there where when the original PlayStation came out, which was, 95, that no longer had us shipping games on these memory chips, which were very expensive. Instead, we could ship a game on a compact disc. And at the time, we were all like, hey, hallelujah, we don't have to do this chips tune stuff anymore because we now have these CDs, and that's what music is delivered on. And that was true to a point, but what happened was pretty quickly, game developers discovered all sorts of other stuff they could put on a compact disc. Full motion videos. I did a game that had 3,000 lines of dialogue, and so the entire the disc is almost entirely dialogue. And so even though we went to the compact disc, which, again, it seemed like a giant leap in memory at the time, but a compact disc only holds about 680 megabytes. Pretty soon, that gets filled up with other stuff. And so we were back to trying to use sort of the sound chip technologies again. I did the first version of John Madden Football for the PlayStation. And because the disc is mostly dialogue and full motion video, with the exception of the opening theme when you first put the disc in, all of the rest of the music in that game is all done with the synthesizer chip that's on board. So yeah, we've been fighting memory our whole lives in game audio.
Which has since lightened up, I assume. I mean, even just game consoles, I mean, those have 8 and 16 gigabytes these days. Do you still find yourself using synthesized audio in modern day, or is it pretty much all sampled?
It's the big change really was 2000, 2001. And again, that's when the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox shipped. And that's where they went from games being on compact disc, which could hold about, again, 680 or so megabytes, to DVDs. And DVDs, depending upon the format, is close to 5 gigabytes, for 4.2, 4.8 gigabytes, or in some cases more than 7 gigabytes.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happened, it actually finally got to be the point where you could just go to a studio, record an orchestra, take your 120 minutes of music. We still would compress it down, but not crunch it awfully, so we could fit more stuff. But that was kind of the death of the sort of sound chip tunes, is when the movement was made and we started shipping games on DVDs, which again hold gigabytes worth of data. And then nowadays, of course, with downloads and Blu-rays, it's even more. And so it's extremely rare that a game these days does the kind of synthesized music like we used to do, again, through about the mid-90s.
Right. Which that whole era of the 80s and 90s, it had such a charm to it, such personality to it. The soundtracks from those eras, I mean, I know a lot of people listening will probably even have some of these old games, soundtracks as their phone ringtone and stuff, or pull it up and listen to it on YouTube just for nostalgia's sake. Even though you guys were quite limited back then, it was remarkable at how much artistic creativity still came through that limited medium. So it's a testament to the creative minds that were trying to build an airplane out of sticks and stones, for sake of metaphor.
That's pretty much it. Yeah, I'd be building airplanes out of sticks, or sticks and stones. Yeah, I miss that era. That was, like you said, I think the word you used was charm. There was sort of a charm to it. The way you wrote was different because you were so limited in the number of concurrent sounds that could play at once, typically either 6 or 8, that you had to craft your music a little bit more deliberately. But, would we go back? Probably not, no. A live orchestra is a wonderful instrument that really can bring you all sorts of things that a, 6-operator 2612 chip on a Sega Genesis just can't.
Right. They can kind of give you the idea, but yeah, it pales in comparison for sure. You're right about that.
Exactly, yeah.
So after, let's say, like the early days, so in around 1998, I recall, was the year you started working at Microsoft. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was at Williams for about 2.5 years, and I, quit a job that I utterly adored and people I loved working with, and I became a freelancer, and that's when I started doing a lot of other sorts of console games and arcade games and stuff like that. And then, yeah, in '98, I got a call from Microsoft saying, "Hey, we're interested in somebody heading up sort of our Windows game audio technology, solution," which at the time was Direct Sound and a new technology called Direct Music. And I didn't think I was gonna do it. I was living in Chicago at the time, and I hopped on a plane just for an interview because 'cause I'd never been to Seattle really before, with no intention of really taking it seriously. And then, a few months later, I'm moving my wife and 9-month-old son out to Seattle to go work for Microsoft. So that was kinda surprising. But there were some pretty interesting things that they were doing at the time. A lot of 3D audio stuff was very interesting. Xbox didn't exist. Xbox had not even been conceived yet, but it was pretty congruent with some of the stuff that I was doing, in the PC sound card base leading up to that. So, yeah, I'm at Microsoft, and it was fun. I discovered that, yeah, Microsoft is a big company, and it was getting a little frustrating. And then it must have been sometime in early mid 1999, I got pulled aside by 2 people that kind of worked with at Microsoft, and they were in a different group, Seamus Blakely and Kevin Backus. And they knew I had done a lot of work in console games. I did consulting for Sega and for Sony, and they showed me a PowerPoint deck, like in a private room, which was this PowerPoint deck that eventually became the Xbox. Because they were like, "Hey, Brian, we're thinking of approaching management and trying to convince them to make a game console. Does that sound kind of interesting? We'd like to, we know you've been doing stuff with console manufacturers before you got here. Would you mind taking a look at this?" And so that was the first I ever heard of. I don't think it was even called Xbox yet. It was Project Midway. And at that point, I got excited about Microsoft again because the prospect of working on building a game console from scratch for a music tech person who likes game consoles was a little bit too good to pass up.
That sounds like a pretty monumental PowerPoint.
Yeah. I wish I had a copy. I think it was even a printed copy of it I saw. I don't even think it was on a computer. But yeah, they eventually convinced the powers that be, which was at the time was Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer, to do it. And so the Xbox program was launched. So pretty quickly after that, I was technically on loan to the Xbox program for a few months, and then I officially transitioned over full-time to just being the Xbox audio program manager. That was, yeah, sometime in '99, probably.
So did you have any sort of influence on, say, I mean, I know you designed the audio architecture for the system, so obviously you had influence on the software side. Did you have any influence on the hardware side as far as what specific chips that they used and sort of the desired specifications of the unit?
Yeah, was one of the first jobs was to, help figure out what sound chip do we stick in the Xbox. Remember, game consoles at the time still had pretty powerful, or reasonably decent sound chips in them because the move hadn't yet been made to fully recorded wave files. And we knew what PlayStation 2's audio system looked like, which was really just a couple of PlayStation 1 audio chips kind of glued together pretty much. And so one of the first things we did was, did a vendor selection and what would be the pros and cons. What if we just went software for audio and had all the audio running off in software on the x86 processor? Or what if we had a new sound chip, what features should it have, how many sounds to be able to play. And we obviously ended up settling on a chip from NVIDIA that they had made based upon the direction that direct sound and direct music were going at the time for Windows. So again, at the time, the PC sound card market was very rich and robust, and NVIDIA had decided they wanted to get into the sound chip market. So they had mostly designed this really powerful audio chip. Even to this day, it would be considered a very, very powerful audio chip called the MCP. And so we had to make some modifications to it because we knew it was going to go on a game console, not as into a PC sound card. And that became the MCPX. And that was kind of the heart of the audio system for the Xbox. And again, it was, remember I said the Sega Genesis could play 6 concurrent sounds. The Sony PlayStation, the first one I think could do, I should know this. It's somewhere in the order of 20. I don't remember if it was 12 or 24. And the PlayStation 2 essentially doubled that. So maybe 48 sounds concurrently. Well, the Xbox chip, we could do 256 concurrently, 64 of which are 3D. We ended up doing some custom stuff with Dolby, which is a whole nother story. We added a separate DSP processor to do real-time Dolby digital surround encoding. So it was a really, really powerful system, audio system on a chip. It was like a full recording studio on a sound chip. So that was definitely a very, very fun thing to, figure out, hey, work with NVIDIA. What changes do we need to make for it to make it useful as a console chip as opposed to a PC chip? And then adding the Dolby stuff. So that was pretty fun.
Yeah, it sounds like quite an expansive sandbox of a chip. Kind of gives you a lot more possibilities, especially in the early 2000s. I mean, consoles were just sort of beginning to break into what we now know as the HD era. I mean, the original Xbox could support up to 1080i, and having 5.1 digital audio through the the Toslink port, that was a pretty big deal. I believe the PlayStation 2 had it also, but it wasn't quite as robust and fleshed out as the Xbox. So it was quite apparent that that was a priority from the start.
So the PlayStation 2 did have an optical out, so you could get digital audio out, but they did not have interactive surround sound. So in other words, you could get surround sound, whether DTS or Dolby, coming out of a PlayStation 2, but only for non-interactive cutscenes. Again, because literally the technology did not exist to be able to essentially encode the audio into Dolby Digital or DTS format at the time. And eventually, some games were able to, in software, do some DTS encoding on the PlayStation. But it was only a small handful of titles ever were able to do that. But for the Xbox, since we had a dedicated DSP designed to do nothing but that, literally every single game on Xbox supports Dolby Digital surround sound in real time. So that was a big marketing point. I remember. Then we worked a lot with Dolby back then. It was on the technical side and the business side. It was let's just say it was challenging getting everything, all the I's dotted and T's crossed on that.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of very talented, skilled people pouring a lot of time and effort into that. So I can't imagine what sort of a complex operation that must have been to get it all together.
Yeah. Again, these days it seems kind of, surround sound just everywhere. But yeah, at the time it was sort of trying to push things forward a little bit.
Right. Which definitely helped make the console feel like this new, almost like alien tech that landed in your living room. So the Xbox with its internal hard drive, with its built-in internet capabilities, and with Dolby 5.1, I mean, that was definitely part of the selling point early on, was just how powerful the system was, and the audio system behind it definitely gave credence to that claim. So it sounds like when you're working on the audio systems for the original Xbox and then later the 360, it's sort of an evolution of what you had been doing for the pinball machines back in the day. So was it a similar experience as far as, you were targeting this very specific chip, which now is being kind of made custom by NVIDIA, which I assume must have been nice. You were developing the software that pushed those signals to the chip, and then also recording and sort of, like you said, putting on that composer hat as well as the programmer hat, right?
Yeah, I didn't really do any composing at Microsoft. So it was kind of like golden cold turkey for me from a composing perspective. And from the tech perspective, because we didn't need the chip to make music, we really only needed it to play back sound effects. And because of, the increased amount of memory in the Xbox compared to like previous consoles, and the fact there was a hard drive, and the fact that games shipped on DVDs meant that technique that I used to do in the, pinball and Super Nintendo days of writing notes and having those played back on the synth really wasn't so much of a thing. If people wanted a fancy sound effect, they went into their digital audio workstation and they crafted a sound. Or if they wanted a, piece of background music for a level or for a boss or for win theme or lose theme, they just go get an orchestra to play it or hire a musician to record it in the studio. And so the playback software in a lot of ways was a lot simpler. And it was more of a, hey, when this thing happens, play these wave files. But we didn't have to like make little melodies occur in the sound chip the way that we did in the old days, because the melodies are all done by the orchestra or by the rock band or the jazz ensemble or whoever they hired to actually do the music.
Right.
So although our chip had the capability of certainly doing that kind of stuff, it didn't really need to. Now, there are other kind of complex sound design things you can get into when you have that many channels to do. And that's one of the things we started doing a year or so after Xbox launched, and we started improving our development tools. But the main software in an old game console was to sort of play the music through these little sequences, and that just really wasn't necessary anymore. So it was sort of a different kind of music playback system that relying a lot more on long pre-recorded wave files, typically done in a professional studio.
Well, there was definitely at least one instance where it came in handy, and that was, of course, when you produced the original Xbox startup animation sound. So for our listeners who aren't privy to that, can you kind of just explain how those sounds were generated and what makes it different from just pre-recorded orchestra-style recordings and such?
Yeah, and this was, just, again, it's just a problem that just kind of we found ourselves having. So very late in the development of the Xbox, we were doing the boot sequence, right? What happened when you started up. And we were very, very careful. We wanted the console to feel like a piece of consumer electronics equipment. We wanted it to boot right away. And there were some spectacularly great programmers on the Xbox team that got the boot time down to just a few seconds, 7 or 8 seconds. And that initializing things, it gets the hard drive spinning, it starts spinning the DVD drive, but it does take time for those things to happen. And again, it ended up taking about 7 or 8 seconds. And during that time, because of the way the Xbox audio circuitry was designed, the only memory available to the entire CPU was what's called the boot ROM. It's a chip, it's a read-only memory chip that has the base OS kernel in it. It has actually a startup animation, which you talked about previously. And they knew, hey, we wanted to do something to fill up that time between when you push the start button and when the Xbox is actually able to start reading the disk and executing the code off the disk. In other words, get into the game experience. And so we, had a visual image, obviously, and we wanted a sound for that. And of course, the problem is that although we have there's a hard drive there with lots of space on it, but literally the computer is not able to read any of that data yet. So this meant that all of the audio information responsible for rendering both the boot animation and the boot sound had to live in this 256 kilobyte ROM, most of which was filled up with computer code to make the Xbox run. And so after Pipeworks did the visual animation, we knew we had to do the sound. And we also discovered at that point, we can't just go record a WAV file because there's only about 27 kilobytes left in this boot ROM after the animation and the core OS code is taken into account. So what I ended up doing, and again, I ended up doing it just because it was so much like what I had done when I was doing console games and arcade games, is I modified a version of that audio system that I had talked about earlier that I had for the arcade systems and the console systems, and I ported it to the Pentium processor in the Xbox to control the MCPX chip. So I now had a way where I could write lists of notes like I used to do in the old days when I was doing pinball machines and have them melodically drive the different synthesizer oscillator parameters of this MCPX chip. And so to get around this weird memory limitation, again, the Xbox during its boot sequence can only access this one ROM memory. I kind of went back to old school techniques, and I was able to record a couple of short sounds that I had in memory, but the rest of it is all synthesized. So I wrote some code to generate some waveforms, and then I used the MCPX chip to play back those waveforms and change parameters on them. The very opening of the boot sound, for example, if people remember, kind of goes, "Wom." Well, that's a wave file that I generated algorithmically in code, put through the MCPX chip, and then was able to modify a digital filter that exists on the MCPX chip, which sort of lets me open up that sound and have it go wah. So it's all done by code, just like the old days. So it was super fun, just because it was, for me, going back to what I cut my teeth on for game audio, and I would never have expected to have to do that in 2001 to generate sound for something. But again, a quirk of the system is that we kind of had to go back to the drawing board for that.
Yeah, it's because of those limitations you had to get creative with how you wanted to produce the end product.
Yeah, and I wanted something obviously that synced with the visual, so I literally got a camcorder, and I obviously had early prototypes of the Pipeworks animation, so I just recorded that on a camcorder. I then went through it frame by frame to figure out where different visual elements occurred in time, and I wrote those down in a spreadsheet. And then I could figure out, okay, how many milliseconds is it between this first blob flash and that next blob flash? Or, how many seconds in does that flying Xbox logo appear? And when does the really bright flash on the screen occur? And so I use that as kind of my template, my roadmap, to then create these little musical sequences out of these various waveforms that I could create on the fly. Or again, I was able to record a couple of very, very bit crunched versions of like a thunder sound, a little bit of a glockenspiel, which is like a little hammered musical instrument. Then I could generate some white noise. That's very easy to generate algorithmically, and it's a very useful sound effect for creating swooshes and whooshes and things like that. So, and I don't know if I was given this as an explicit aesthetic direction. It'd be interesting to chat with the Pipeworks folks. But I remember the ideas that the Xbox was this sort of organic thing that had all this power inside of it that it wanted to burst forth into your living room. And so I kind of shaped the sound to match that kind of core aesthetic where it starts filtered, opens itself up, and then kind of crescendos into that big flash, which again was the power of the Xbox bursting forth from your television into your living room. I don't know if that's the official thing, but the kind of cool evolving visual that Pipeworks had done did that. And so it was natural to make the sound follow it.
Yeah, and I was just reading back through an article on GameSoundCon.com earlier today, and said that you sampled those, the Thunder and the Glockenspiel and other samples down at 6 kilohertz sampling rate, which these days is pretty abysmal, but you were also able to take those samples and apply filters on top of them to sort of add extra texture and make it sound more clear than a horribly crushed little piece of a sampled wave.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. Yeah, because I can easily generate in code triangle waves and sine waves and square waves, and I did that. But if I used only those waves in the boot sound, it would definitely have sounded very Nintendo-y and very chiptune-like. We definitely did not want a chiptune vibe coming out of the Xbox. But those waveforms, because I generated them in code, they were full 48,000 samples per second DVD quality audio sounds. And I found that if I layered those on top of the horribly bit crushed thunder sounds and things that I recorded, and I layered them together, that I could kind of mask the fact that the thunder sound was so bit crushed. by
Mhm.
adding this filtered white noise on top of it, which is full fidelity. So it was kind of a little bit of a sleight of hand there.
That's actually very similar to a technique that level designers would have like a small bitmap texture, blow it up over the side of a mountain, and then add like a noise shader on top to give it that extra detail. So in a way,
Oh,
you're
yeah.
kind of using those same techniques, but in the audio field. So that's very interesting. Sort of a trick to just add more detail to something that didn't have it to begin with through a
Exactly.
programmatic means.
Programmatic means another word for it, cheating. Yes.
Well, I'd call it a bit of magic. Let's say it's more like a magic
Okay.
trick. So so you said you recorded with a camcorder. Now I'm wondering if it was like a VHS camcorder. I'm kind of picturing a big bulky VHS recorder, but
No, no, no. It actually was, I had been in Japan, like a few months earlier, and I bought a newfangled digital camcorder that had this super high resolution 480p. But it also is nice because the frame quality was very good, and I could see some detail
Mhm.
even in the still frames.
So that gave you the cadence and the timing and the tempo. And you said that you also got this idea that it was a mechanical organic thing bursting into their living rooms. Did that creative directive, did that come from the Microsoft side, or like, is that something you concluded after talking with the guys at Pipeworks? Like, where did that sort of theme stem from?
I was trying to think that. I'm not actually sure, but I remember I think it was Seamus that was contacting with them. And so I would just see new builds of the animation. And so I think what most likely happened was that as I saw what the visual animation was, it became pretty clear what the sound should do to kind of match that, the evolution of it. And I do feel like at some point, some of the marketing people, like, I don't know, may have said, yeah, we want, the feeling of power that is inside itching to get out of the Xbox or something like that. But yeah, it was really just based upon what the visuals were doing. It's like, "Oh, how can I create a sound that supports these visuals using the sort of limited technique that I have and not making it sound chiptune?" And this is one of the very last things that was done on the Xbox before we went into pre-production. In fact, I actually caused a problem in pre-production. Uh,
Really? What's that?
so the boot sound only had like 2 or 3 iterations on it, and then it shipped, which these days for a boot icon sound, it would usually go through multiple layers of VP approval and have infinite revisions done to it, but we just did not have time. I think we were just happy that the thing was able to make noise at all, so it's like, "Hey, okay, it's not gonna be silent, yay."
And to not sound like a Game Boy.
Yeah, exactly, and not sound like a Game Boy. But yeah, it was a little embarrassing because there was as we were putting the original Xbox into pre-production, there was a strange bug reported from the factory that, like, around 1 in 1,000 times you tried to boot an Xbox, it just would hard hang, and it wouldn't you'd have to either unplug it. Either had to unplug it or plug it in again or something like that. It was literally a ship-stopping bug, and it turned out, remember that audio driver system I was talking about that I ported from the game consoles? Well, I introduced a bug that, if timing was just right, would cause a crash in the Xbox kernel. So yeah, I had a bug in my audio code that drives the boot sound that caused a production delay.
And it's not like in modern days where they could just push down an update over the air and fix it. So it's a good thing they found it in their thorough testing. Otherwise,
Yeah.
that could have been a debacle.
And in fairness, it's a really subtle, weird bug unique to that processor. So, but it was my bug.
You mentioned you sampled a few, like the Thunder and the Glockenspiel and stuff. So where did those come from? Did you like go out and record a thunderstorm, or are those from like stock assets, or did you make it yourself?
Yeah, at the time, again, I'd spent a decade as a freelance composer and sound designer, so I had a fairly large library by that time of either sound effects libraries I had licensed, or I'd done a lot of custom recording, and so I had a lot of sounds myself. The Glockenspiel, I don't recall where that came from. The Thunder was a bunch of, because in Chicago we'd get weather all the time, and so I have a bunch of different recordings of various types of thunder from uh, that I was able to get over the years. Yeah, again, I'd approach it just as a sound designer working on other projects, like some combination of sounds from a sound effects library, some custom recorded sounds. And again, for me, it was just a matter of how do I trim them so they're super, super short and crunch them down. One of the things I was able to do as well is right into the lead up of that big bright flash where the Xbox logo appears. I was actually write a little bit of code to take that thunder sound and reverse it, so it plays backwards leading up to it. That's again kind of a manipulation of some of the raw wave files themselves.
Yeah.
I think there was a cannon sound in there too, and that I would have gotten from a library. I didn't record any cannons.
You didn't go out to your backyard and fire off a cannon.
No, I have friends who have done weapon recording sessions, and they sound amazingly fun. I'd love to go on one sometime, but I've never actually done that. So yeah, the cannon sound would have come from a library.
There's kind of a piece of lore that's been lingering around for the past few years. Do you know anything about this long lost Easter egg that Seamus keeps hinting at? He revealed that in 2017, I think it was in 2017, he said that there's an Easter egg that no one's found yet in the boot animation. And I've been bugging him about it here and there over the course of the past few years. And you're one of the few people who worked on it. So I figured I'd just ask you, do you know what he's talking about? Have you seen it? Do you have any idea what that could be?
In the animation, I have not heard of this.
And yeah, I don't know if it's only visual or if there's audio involved,
Yeah.
but I was just kind of curious. Did you make like an offshoot that when this Easter egg appears and now there's a separate audio? Yeah, it's just anything like that.
No, yeah, it was right up to the wire, just getting the required boot sound in time. The only Easter egg I'm actually aware of is the one that shows the credit of everybody who worked on it. And I think you get to that not from the boot sequence, but from the dashboard.
Right. That'd be in reference to the eggs box. You go into the soundtrack
Exactly.
editor and save it with a special name. And when talking with Seamus, I specifically asked him, is it something in the dashboard or is it in the boot animation itself? And he's like, it's the boot animation before the dashboard loads. And so I asked the Piper guys about it. They had no idea what I was talking about. And they also said, we had to sign agreements that we wouldn't include any special hints or nods, and things like that. So, yeah. So they didn't know what I was talking about. So I guess I'll just have to have Seamus on one of these days and sit him down and finally be like, what are you talking about, man? But
What's this boot animation Easter egg we're hearing about?
Yep. It's been kind of my white whale lately, but anyway, so I appreciate you answering that. I kind of assumed that would be the case. So kind of reflecting on your tenure at Microsoft, so what do you consider to be, let's say, your most significant contribution to the consoles, either between the 360 or the original? What would you say is sort of your crowning achievement that you're most proud of for contributing to those consoles?
Probably cross between the Dolby Digital stuff and the boot sound. The Dolby Digital, that took 2 years to get that done. And it was a really interesting challenge of technological issues as well as business and legal issues, which I actually kind of find equally as fascinating. Because one of the reasons Dolby Digital is in the Xbox is when I first got to Microsoft, right, there was no Xbox. But one of the things that, I was sort of put on was, hey, Microsoft wants to get PCs into people's living rooms. We think that's a beachhead Microsoft needs to be at. And so for me as an audio person, for gaming, one of the things I thought would be really cool is what if we had surround sound for video games in people's living room? That would be a reason for people to put their PC in their living room because DVD players were relatively new, only, a few years old. And so people did start to have surround sound systems in their living rooms in a way that they don't usually in the room where their personal computer was. And so I had some meetings with some folks at Dolby saying, hey, what would it take to do this? And at the time, they didn't think it was possible because of latency issues and things like that. But this goes back to around 98. So again, well before Xbox launched. But when the Xbox happened, we sort of picked up those conversations again. And it turned out we figured out a way to allow the sort of surround sound processing to happen in real time. So that it was a lot of work. And it was featured very prominently in the marketing materials. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why I feel like it's in terms of leaving my mark on the Xbox, that probably would have been it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty big deal back in the day as far as audio. I mean, people tend to focus on just the visual aspect of games, but audio, of course, brings a whole other feel. It's like when silent movies became movies with audio, it adds a whole nother layer to
Yep.
it. And then when you take it into the third dimension, I was fortunate enough back in 2005 era to actually have a surround sound system. I remember booting up games like Burnout and Halo, and it was a treat. And it definitely helps in modern days in 2024. I mean, the Xbox earlier this month had its 23rd anniversary, which
Yep. November
It-
15th, 2001.
Yep. But anyways, what I was saying is now 23 years later, those kinds of innovations that were bleeding edge back in the day help it make it so that this console is still being enjoyed 23 years later. Like there's still an active community of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. I mean, in our communities alone, there's about like 80, 90,000 people who are still participating and active and interested in this console years later. And a part of that is because it was so forward thinking with its hard drive, with its Ethernet, with its HD capabilities, and with its audio. So I definitely think all that work was worthwhile to help keep it relevant and interesting and useful. You don't need to run it through an emulator to have these fancy effects. It's all right there on the system, built in from day one. So it's as far as being a piece of future tech coming into your living room, I'd say you guys accomplished it.
Yeah, and it certainly was great working. You mentioned games like Halo, and Halo pushed the surround sound almost like no other game did. And you should have Marty O'Donnell on, because he was the
Hopefully.
audio director at Bungie.
Yeah.
And so we were sort of on opposite sides of the fence here, right? I'm trying to ship an Xbox and make sure that it, get it up and running from scratch, and they're trying to ship Halo from scratch. And so, I definitely spent lots of time with Marty over the months leading up to Xbox launch. Working with the audio system and is the surround sound working, and how's all that going? So it was really great. He did a lot to help keep us honest on the audio team. In fact, he would find really subtle audio bugs that we missed.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, there was a mysterious 6 dB discrepancy between what the API said they should be and what the actual output was, and, everything was totally fine relative to one another, but it was just off by a few dB. And he's like, "Brian, what's going on here? I'm measuring, -6 when I should be getting -12." And sure enough, we had a factor of 2 bug around somewhere.
hmm So I assume he just had to account for that in his design process like that. I know the Xbox kernel really had some revisions over the course of a few years, but did you guys update anything related to the audio in those revisions?
Um, probably some routine bug fixes or performance optimizations here and there. We did end up creating a separate kind of audio tool after we launched. It came out about 9 months or a year after we launched, to allow developers to better access some of the features of the very sophisticated sound chip. It was a program called XAC, the Xbox Audio Creation Tool. But the raw drivers themselves, again, except for bug fixes and things, I doubt that. I don't recall making any major changes on that.
Yeah, man, that's fair. Bug fixes, sure, but
Right, yeah.
it's kind of locked in at that point.
Yeah. And the idea was that, direct sound on the Xbox was designed to be a thin layer sitting on top of that powerful audio chip. It was reasonably simple from one perspective.
Right. Kind of the whole point of DirectX and the Xbox itself was to get Windows out of the way and stop being a resource hog, basically. So
Yeah, the Xbox was a direct Xbox. That's kind of where Xbox came from.
right. As stripped down and as optimized as it could be, and still going strong to this day, right? I wanted to also ask about, there was something interesting I read is one of your songs from NARC was either performed by or had a collaboration with the Pixies, and apparently went on to become a part of their album. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, this would go back to the arcade game days again. One of the last games that I did at Williams before I went to be a freelancer was an arcade game called NARC. It was a time that was cutting edge graphics because it actually used visual photo images. And so that was, really fun. And I worked on that, and then I left. And then I just found out, I only found out because the game designer, Eugene Jarvis, who also he was designer for games like Robotron and Stargate and Defender and so on, came to a party at my house, and he brought with him a CD by the Pixies. And so unbeknownst to me, Williams, the Pixies, their lead singer apparently really liked NARC and approached Williams about doing a cover version of the main theme from it. So they apparently worked out this deal. Right. Since I was an employee of Williams, it's not like I own the music or anything. So it was all done without my knowledge. But then I just discovered that they released it on 2 of their albums. One is the complete B-sides. Oh shoot, what's the other one? But yeah, it's kind of a hard rocking version of the main theme. They did put the lyrics on it. The lyrics are just theme from NARC. And that's it.
Really?
It's all instrumental.
Oh, that's great. Well, yeah, if anyone wants to go listen to that it's up on YouTube and Spotify. It's called Theme from NARC. It's by the Pixies. It's very cool that they decided to pick that up.
It annoys me a little bit because if you look at the credits in Spotify, it lists the singer for the Pixies as the songwriter. But I've contacted them a couple times on that, and they say, "Oh yeah, we'll get around to fixing that," and they just never quite have. Well, when you add lyrics to a song, you become a co-writer of it, and so maybe that's what it is that because they added theme from NARC.
Yeah. Oh, that's that's very cool. Yeah, when I heard about that, I was like, "What? Really?" So I haven't listened to it yet, but I'm definitely gonna go check it out after
That
this.
totally sound made because it's not the kind of song with like a hummable thing. It's like, in fact, I read an interview with Black Francis, the lead of the Pixies, who said he liked it because the chord progression was all effed up. But I took it as a compliment. It's like, yeah, it's not a standard rock and roll chord progression. So
Also, just talking about the current era, you founded the Game Sound Con, which you just wrapped another one up in this past October. Can you kind of tell our listeners what that's about and how they can kind of form more information about what you're doing in that arena?
yeah, sure. Yeah, I kind of feel like I've had 3 careers, right? But the first part, I was very prolific as a composer, sound designer in the console days. Then I had about 10 years at Microsoft as they're doing a lot of tech stuff with the Xbox and whatnot. And then since then, I've kind of become involved in like education and community. I mentioned being in Japan when I was at Xbox. We used to spend a lot of time flying around the world teaching people how to do sounds for the Xbox. What are the features of this very sophisticated chip? How does it work? How do you do it? And you recall I said at the time we started shipping games on DVD. And what that meant is that the archaic skill that I had of making chip tunes is no longer a thing that's needed in games, but you just needed to be able to be a good music producer or music creator, composer, orchestrator, whatever. And so around that time, a lot of people from traditional media like film and television started wanting to do games. And for reasons that I could go on for hours about, doing music for a game is different in some fairly significant ways than doing it for, let's say, a film or a television show. And I would find that the composers coming from Hollywood, when they were doing their first game, like an Xbox game, they were stumbling over the same kinds of issues. They just did not get this difference between working in an interactive medium like games and a linear medium like film or television. And so when I left Microsoft, one of the things I thought would be useful was, hey, I bet it would be useful to have kind of like a boot camp for people who are used to doing sound and music in traditional medium, but who now want to do games. And so I started a conference for that called Game Sound Con. That was back in 2009. And then over the years, it just kind of grown. And so now it's not just for people who are new to games, but also for established game composers. So yeah, we had our last Game Sound Con in Burbank last month, the end of October. There are about 850 or so people in person for it. Again, largely professional composers and sound designers. A lot of them will work on games. And we had another couple hundred, 200 or 300 online because we pretty much streamed the whole thing.
Oh, very
So
cool.
it's been really fun just sort of seeing the game audio community grow and sharing stories and, how did you do the music for Helldivers 2, Will Roger, and tell us about the compositional techniques you used or what technologies you used. So that's been really fun.
So did you have much to do with the audio capture and systems and how that worked for the voice communicator and for Xbox Live?
Yeah, I did eventually. I guess they figured since I'm audio that I could be the voice person as well. So I don't recall exactly when, but I ended up being the Xbox audio and voice program manager eventually. So the voice chat on Xbox Live and how all the voice over IP stuff worked. And, even though it has an Ethernet port on it, here we're here, 2024, right? Back in 2001, if you were able to get 64 kilobit internet, that was considered pretty high speed for the home. And so a lot of what we spent in the Xbox voice system was, how can we possibly take voice data, scrunch it down, and you're using data compression to scrunch it down into extremely small audio data packets and transmit it over, and assuming that people only had 64 kilobit internet. Remember I said full fidelity audio requires 48,000 numbers per second. And I think we got that down to somewhere around 800. It's massively crunched down for the original Xbox and Xbox 360 as well.
What's interesting about original Xbox, 360, you have a generic codec for all of Xbox Live. It's built into the system. For original Xbox, it's built into every game individually. So there's a couple of games that it sounds a little better, but Modalista has very high quality audio. It's like 128K or something. It's really good.
Yeah, we didn't have as much turnkey solutions for the Xbox voice chat for the original Xbox as we did later on. And so I guess what that means is that, somebody who really knows what they're doing could do their own thing. And if they thought that the voice quality should be prioritized over certain kinds of game data, then they could do that. What game was that had the really, really good voice chat?
Modalista. It's a racing game. Japanese-based racing game from Capcom.
Okay.
It's like 2002, 2003.
Wow.
2004 on Xbox, so very, kind of late on Xbox Live.
While we're on the topic of audio, Brian, did you have anything to do with the audio that we hear on the dashboard?
No, most of that was done, I'm pretty sure by a company called Sound Deluxe. And so aside from listening to it and being asked my opinion of it, that was outsourced to them.
Well, that was the next question I was going to ask you. What is the opinion? Because a lot of people say it's got like a space kind of feel to it, very out of this planet kind of sound. So
Very creepy, by the way.
what are your thoughts? Yeah, very creepy. It's got like voices that talk to you, and people thought it was giving a message.
Yeah.
So you had people trying to record and play it backwards and do all this stuff. So
Yeah, for them, for the dashboard, since the Xbox was fully booted and up and running, they had access to the hard drive. And so all that data was recorded in a studio and then put on the hard drive. So that's where they were able to go to an outsourced company. They could just kind of do that. That's their thing.
sure. And earlier you touched bases on the MCPX by NVIDIA. Now, there was rumors going around that originally the CPU that was going to be used was going to be AMD powered before, I guess, Microsoft did a backflip and went to Intel. Do you know anything about that by any chance?
I do know that, right, we were trying to, you do vendor chip selection. And at the time, there weren't a lot of choices for what CPU we would use. So the people with negotiating skills above mine, I'm sure, did the actual CPU deal, and whether that involved some gamemanship where they leak information about one and then go with the other, I don't know. But I do know that all there were several chips from different manufacturers that were under consideration. And we ended up going with the Pentium 3.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
So beside Game SoundCon, what are you working on these days? What's sort of the projects that you're tinkering with?
Well, I do music and sound design for a game called Mutant Football League, which is, I have fun with that because it's sort of a spiritual successor to an EA game I did in 1993 on the Genesis. The same person who designed that game has his own company, and we did Mutant Football League. We shipped first in 2017. I've been doing yearly updates for that, and are currently going to release sort of a whole revamped Mutant Football League too. So I have fun doing that. I teach a little bit. I teach game audio at a school called DigiPen Institute of Technology, which is if you want to be like a game programmer, it's a really good school to go to. But they started up a music and sound design program a few years ago, so I teach there. I've got a book about half done that I've been just have to crunch out the last 30,000 words of and wrap that up. So yeah, just kind of keeping busy with different kinds of things.
If folks want to find out about you, what's a good place that they can reach you, either like on social media or online? Like, how can people find out about your work?
Let's see, if you Google me, I did not win the Nobel Prize in astrophysics. That was a different Brian Schmidt. When he won that, my Google rankings tanked pretty big. Because, discovering dark energy and the fact that the universe is expanding faster at an accelerating rate, they figure is more important than pinball composer. If you Google me with composer or game, you'll see a bunch of my stuff, which will point you either to Game Sound Con. My website is Brian Schmidt Studios. I'm at Game Sound on Twitter, although I'm mostly on Blue Sky now more than Twitter. So yeah, Game Sound Con is probably the best place to follow stuff in terms of stuff that I've been writing and things like that, or just thoughts about the industry. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find on Google. Once you eliminate the astrophysicist, Nobel Prize was an astrophysicist.
So if you eventually get a PhD in astrophysics, it's going to make it a lot harder to find you and know which one you are.
It's crazy because there was a time where I almost, in undergrad, almost went into this thing about going into astronomy. I wrote a paper on stellar evolution and the solar neutrino problem, and the professor was like, "Have you thought about doing astronomy?" So I'm really glad else I'd be spending my entire life telling people, no, that was a different Brian Schmidt that won the Nobel Prize. That wasn't me.
You and Seamus must have had some pretty interesting conversations out at the water cooler then. That seems to be a topic that he's very interested in as well.
That's a topic he's very passionate about, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those were good times at Xbox. It's probably professionally, from a career perspective, that, year and a half leading up to Xbox and shortly after launch was probably one of the most fulfilling bits of professional work, just because it's a vibrant project. We were given authority to make decisions fast and execute on them. And they, for the most part, they trust our judgment when we recommend things, because we didn't have time to have lots of committee meetings and discuss things to death. It was all very, very matter of fact and get it done. We got to get this thing out there and on the store shelves for Christmas 2001.
That sounds like a blessing and a curse. I imagine there must have been a lot of pressure, but at the same time, they put people into positions that could make those decisions. And Microsoft is a big old tanker ship. And, by doing that, it allowed them to turn on a dime in moments when they needed to. So I'm glad they had folks like you and like Seamus and like, everyone else on the Xbox team to help push them into avoiding just becoming an Excel spreadsheet company through the rest of time. So
exactly right. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask, just as we kind of close out on this episode, so for any aspiring people who want to get into the video game music industry and composition and that sort of thing, are there any tips or advice you have for anyone listening?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get asked that a lot, obviously. It's a very networking-driven industry. So at the risk of sounding self-serving, you want to be engaged and go to in-person events where you can, whether it's a local game jam, a game audio meetup, a conference like Game Sound Con or the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco. A lot of people are doing a lot more online, being part of online communities. Again, Blue Sky has a burgeoning, pretty, growing fast game audio community. So there's lots of interesting things to learn. You want to learn about some of the main differences between linear and nonlinear media, some of the game audio tools that are out there. But yeah, just, play games so you know what's out there, get to know people, whether in online networks or ideally in-person networks, and have fun. It's a fun industry. It's obviously going through its shakes here and there, with layoffs and whatnot, but there's been a pretty steady flow of pretty good game audio jobs there, ranging from, God of War Ragnarok through casual games made by, a dozen people.
Well, very well said. And Brian, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your insights with us. I feel like this conversation could probably go on for 4 or 5 hours if we let it. I really appreciate you telling us about your time at Xbox, and we'd love to have you back on at some point in the future if you feel like it's, we do have an open seat for you, because I know we didn't really even touch on the Xbox 360 era either. But I thank you very much for coming on and spending the time with us, Brian.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having an interest in the topic. It's always good to see. You don't think about them when you're doing them, but sometimes what you're doing does need to be part of a record somewhere. And so all this stuff that is just in our brains, it's nice to have people like you care enough to archive them and make sure things don't get lost to history. So I really appreciate that.
And I appreciate you saying that too. That's definitely one of the goals with this podcast. It's something we talked about in the first episode, was just saying that a lot of these stories kind of exist, like you said, in people's minds, and we're just trying to get it out there so it's not so much in sort of a small, tight-knit community, and it can kind of be shared with the wider audience, especially for newcomers who are coming on so many years later after it's past its heyday. You know, they might be rediscovering this console for the first time, you know, in 2024, for example. So they don't really have the context of all these past eras. They didn't live through it. So we're also trying to welcome and introduce those newcomers into it who are discovering this console and finding use for it, even, you know, in today's era. So yeah, we love talking with you and hope to chat with you soon.
All right.
For all of our listeners, thanks so much for hanging out with us and hearing our stories. If you guys want to follow us, join the Xbox Scene Discord. We hang out there and chat about the original Xbox and related communities. Also join the subreddit. You can hear these episodes on YouTube and on Spotify. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us and we'll be happy to chat with you. So with that, we'll leave it for next time. Thank you so much for listening and have a good rest of your day.